There can be no doubt about it. The horror of the Second Sino-Japanese War still exists in the shadow of World War II, and what a ridiculous truth that is. How could such a terrible scar be forgotten? How can all those lives, not figures, lives, be swept under the rug? Of course, we needn't always think of such things, but when we want to, when we punch World War II into Google or fire up a documentary, why isn't Chinese suffering the first thing we see? Well, there are many reasons for this, most being political, though in this video, we're not looking at the why so much as the what, and we're not going to focus on big, terrifying death and casualty numbers. Instead, we're going to try and paint the suffering of China in the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II in a different light, focusing on how China's bravery attributed to its own survival and an Allied victory. Before we get into China's bravery and contributions to the Allied cause, it's important we know at least the basics of the Second Sino-Japanese War, as during this conflict was when China suffered most, and during this suffering was when China exhibited much of its bravery. Basically, Sino-Japanese relations had been bad for quite a while, though things escalated with the Mukden or Manchurian incident, in which the Japanese blew up one of their own railways in China and blamed the Chinese, and the subsequent Japanese invasion of Manchuria, which began on the 18th of September 1931. Here, the Imperial Japanese invaded the Chinese regions known collectively as Manchuria and set up a puppet state, which they called Manchukuo. What followed was some 6 years of skirmishing until the Japanese pressed forward and enjoyed a series of major victories, capturing Beijing, Shanghai, and what was then the Chinese capital, Nanking. Other Chinese cities were lost to the Japanese invaders though, marked by a costly victory in the 1939 Battle of Changsha, where the Chinese defenders managed to slow their enemy's advance, turning the tide of the conflict thereon, but not without spending many more Chinese lives. The Second Sino-Japanese War continued as basically a distinct theatre of World War II, in which the Chinese kept their occupiers thoroughly occupied. Yet keeping the Japanese busy was in itself a crucial contribution to the Allied victory, and some of the battles which occurred in this time, including the aforementioned and pivotal 1939 Battle of Changsha, speak for the bravery of this nation, which is so often consigned to an afterthought when pondering the Second World War. Let's begin by encompassing the Second Sino-Japanese War as a World War II theatre on a whole, and then narrow our scope to encompass that pivotal battle, the First Battle of Changsha, before discussing China's alliance with the Allies and its involvement in Burma. While the United States had become China's main military supporter by 1940, the Chinese military was generally unprepared for war of this caliber, lacking the industry to equip a modern force. As a result, they made use of the Fabian strategy, avoiding head-on conflicts and aiming to starve their enemy in a war of attrition. Specifically, they used scorched earth strategies, flooding their own land to bog down their enemy, and they also lured their enemy into compromising positions, from which they could ambush, flank, and encircle them. Paramilitary resistance forces were employed, and these were tasked with making Japanese occupation as difficult as possible. The Chinese also made good use of their home ground advantage, sneaking through the countryside between Japanese-held cities and sabotaging railways and crucial Japanese-held infrastructure, such as coal mines. So why is all of this significant? Well, the Chinese were playing for time and, more importantly, wasting Japanese time. The Japanese troops in China were stuck there, growing hungry and fighting the exact opposite of the quick war they were planning to win. As such, they were not fighting the Allies in any of the other theatres, most notably the Pacific. Of course, the number of Japanese soldiers in China changed from day to day, though some 600,000 were there in 1937 and around twice that many were there in 1945. Now, let's zoom in on the First Battle of Changsha in 1939. As we said earlier, this was a pivotal battle for the Chinese, marking the end of the unchecked Japanese advance. Here, a 100,000 strong Japanese force, comprised of the 11th Army and commanded by Imperial Japanese General Yasuji Okamura, converged on the provincial capital Changsha from two sides. The Chinese defenders had the numbers, boasting a strength of some 240,000 troops of the 9th War Area's 1st, 19th, 20th, 27th and 30th Army groups, which were commanded by Chen Cheng. The result was a battle in which the Chinese made excellent use of the aforementioned Fabian strategy, avoiding head-on fighting and instead luring their enemy into compromising positions before flanking and encircling them. They were also sure to destroy as many of their enemy supply lines as possible. The October 16th, 1939 issue of Time magazine summed it up quite well. The Chinese turned around and, with the fury they've never shown before, lashed the Japanese back and back. The Chinese destroyed every rail line, every road. The Japanese blithely advanced over this torn-up area until they were in the worst military position known to man, on a thin front without communications behind. That was when the Chinese struck. The Japanese had nothing to do but run. As we said before, the United States was China's main military benefactor after 1940, though it wasn't until after the attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941 that China joined the Allies and declared war on the tripartite Axis powers. A bit over a month later, the Chinese defeated the Japanese in the Third Battle of Changsha, gaining the respect of the Allied powers, and China soon after earned its place as one of them, as one of the Big Four. It wasn't all smooth sailing, however, and we must acknowledge that political and strategic differences were a cause for tension. For instance, it is postulated that the Allies wanted China to be more aggressive, while China wanted to continue fighting a defensive war of attrition, while the US built up its industry and overwhelmed the Japanese for them. This, of course, would have caused the Allies to lose some of their confidence in China. It's also important to note that prior to the support of Western allies, the Soviet Union provided China most of its foreign aid. The Soviets even defeated Japan and Manchukuo in the battles of Khalkhin Gol, instilling fear in the Japanese and dissuading their advance into China, for a time. And also, before World War II, Germany actually supported the Chinese Nationalist Party, Kuomintang, providing some 80,000 Chinese soldiers, who later fought for China as a whole, with military training. Hitler, however, withdrew the support in favour of an alliance with China's principal enemy, Japan. Now onto Chinese involvement in Burma. For some context, Burma was a part of the British Empire at the start of World War II, and after the United States became China's military benefactor, it supplied China through Burma via the Burma Road. The Japanese, naturally, didn't want to let China get those supplies, and they also wanted to seize Burma's raw materials, its oil, its cobalt, and even its rice, so they invaded Burma from the south, though not without resistance. See, protecting Burma Road was an obvious reason for China to put down its foot, though China was now also one of the Big Four, and its ally Britain, as well as British Burma and British India, needed a hand. While the Allies were ultimately forced to withdraw, surrendering Burma and the Burma Road to the Japanese, the Chinese Expeditionary Force was there, and despite being poorly equipped, it fought bravely. One particular conflict in which said bravery shone was the Battle of Yengangwang on the 19th of April 1942. Here, the Burma Corps, a British, Indian and Burmese force, was defending the Irrawaddy River when the Japanese attacked, intending to take the Yengangwang oil fields, which were in the valley. Ultimately, 7,000 soldiers of the Burma Corps, as well as some 500 prisoners and civilians, were encircled by around 7,000 Japanese soldiers on the oil field, and things were looking grim. But then, rallied under Chinese General Sun Li-jen, a force of 1,121 Chinese, of which some 400 weren't even soldiers, came to their rescue, breaking the encirclement, inflicting heavy casualties on the Japanese, and forcing them to withdraw. Even though the Allies did withdraw from Burma in 1942, they were able to take it back from their enemy between early 1943 and early 1945, though not without the Chinese Expeditionary Force, which fought side by side with the famed US Special Forces unit named Merrill's Marauders. By the end of the war, China was one of the Big Four allies and it held a seat on the United Nations Security Council, though for a whole bunch of complicated political reasons which we've gracefully avoided in this video, China's contributions to the Allied victory were swept under the rug, only becoming a topic for discussion in the wake of the Cold War. Millions of Chinese soldiers and civilians lost their lives in the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II, and many of these men and women died fighting for China's survival and the Allied cause. They were more than just numbers, and their bravery and sacrifice must not be forgotten. And just before you go guys, I want to reiterate that this video is specifically talking about China in a World War II context, and in that context only. We're not bringing in any contemporary political issues, and we hope to keep it that way in the comments, although I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen. But on a brighter note, if you want to check out all the video sources and chat with other history buffs, make sure you check out our Discord link in the description below. And if you want to help support the channel, please do check out the Patreon. If you do decide to donate, you get access to a special behind the scenes Discord that's invite only, where you can see how myself and my team operate. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.